was just kind of praying over what I wanted to speak about this week, over the last couple months, I've been going through, in my own time, just going through the book of Luke. And I came across this one passage. It's just a small piece of a sermon that Jesus gave. And when I came across it, I just immediately, the Lord told me, you need to teach this passage. I have something here for you that I want you to learn. And when I felt that, I was like, okay, like I'm ready. Like I will teach this passage. And so I had the opportunity to teach it to our students at youth group a couple weeks ago. And normally when I have this feeling like, oh man, I really want to teach this passage or something I get excited about or something the Lord's teaching me, once I have that opportunity, it's like, okay, the itch has been scratched, I'm good. Like there's a lot of material here. I feel like I don't need to go back to that passage for like 15 years, right? Like I feel good. But then as I was praying over what to speak on today, the Lord kept bringing it up. And I was like, no, I already taught it. Like, I'm good, we're good, it's fine. Like, I don't need to go back to that. And he kept saying, no, Kelsey, there's more here for you. There's more here for you. And so I went back and I just was studying it more and more. And the Lord just revealed to me that in this piece of a sermon that Jesus gave 2,000 years ago, he actually gives us a solution to, I think, what is one of the largest problems that we face today as a generation. See, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but the world is a little divided right now. Can I say that? Like, I don't know if you felt this maybe, but we're just a little bit on edge, right? The Washington Post, University of Maryland, put out a poll 2 years ago, and it asked Americans whether or not they felt that this time was as divided as it was during the Vietnam War. And 7 out of 10 Americans said that it was. And I read that. I'm a millennial. I wasn't alive during the Vietnam War. I was like, nope, I'm sorry. Like, I wasn't alive, but I read my history books. Like, there is no way that people are just overreacting. So I looked at this poll a little bit more. And 70% of those polled who were over the age of 65, so who were alive and remember the Vietnam War, said that America today is just as divided as it was then. 70%. That is a huge statement. That is a huge thing to claim, right? And I think that we all feel this, right? Not just as a nation, as a country, not just politically. We feel divisions over every area of our lives, across every different type of difference and boundary. We feel it not just on a national level, we feel it at the dinner table, right? Like when you go home to visit your family, there's always the laundry list of things that you are not allowed to bring up, right? Like there's always stuff like, you don't talk about this, you don't talk about this. Okay, we're going to get in, we're going to get out. We're not going to have any arguments this weekend, right? Like that's how we approach life. Because these divisions have not only seeped into us as a country, but into our personal relationships. We feel this between one another. We feel very deeply divided. There was another poll done by an organization called More in Common. And they discovered when polling Americans that 67% are in what they called the exhausted majority. I know half of you are like, yeah, I didn't need a poll to tell me I was exhausted. Thank you very much. 67% of Americans are exhausted with the state of things. And these Americans differ over a variety of worldviews, core beliefs, demographics. But they all share this one thing in common. They are tired at the way things are. They are fatigued. They are more willing to compromise. But here's the thing. I think the reason that we're so exhausted is because the problem feels so big, right? It feels huge. Like what on earth? I am one person in Spokane, Washington. Like half the people have never heard of it. The other half of people can't pronounce it. Like there's no way that I can be the one to resolve this global issue. It feels impossible. It feels massive. Maybe there are other people in power with more influence than me who might be able to do something about it, but certainly it's not me, right? It feels like an impossible problem. And when I was looking at this sermon from Jesus, I realized that what he had to say provided a solution. And a solution that each and every one of us can enact. So this morning, we are going to be looking at Luke chapter 6. Now, Before we go into his actual sermon, just a little bit of background about the person of Jesus. This might be common knowledge, but I think it's important to mention. Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, but he wasn't the only Jewish rabbi, right? There were other rabbis walking around during the first century, preaching and witnessing to the same people who had their own disciples who were following them and their instructions. Right? So Jesus wasn't the only guy doing this. And because he wasn't the only rabbi, we can kind of compare what Jesus would do to what was the norm, what your average rabbi would do, if that's kind of a weird phrase to say, but that we can compare and contrast what Jesus did to the norm. And before we get into the sermon, in some of the incidences that happened previous to this, we see that Jesus did not act in a way that was expected of him in that culture and society. For instance, there's a moment where a group of friends bring their paralyzed friend to the feet of Jesus. And the first thing Jesus does isn't heal him, but forgive him of his sins. That is not something a rabbi would do. That's not something your average rabbi would do. There are moments where Jesus feasts with tax collectors. These are the most hated men in society, and he shared a meal with them, inviting them in to relationship with him. This was not something your average rabbi would do. Jesus would eat, and he would perform miracles and heal on the Sabbath, which was supposed to be the day of rest. That was not something a rabbi would do. The way Jesus lived his life, the things he did, the things he taught were countercultural. And in fact, it upset a lot of people. A number of the Jewish teachers were very frustrated that he didn't behave in the way that he should have. And they had their eyes on him. They were watching him. To put it short, Jesus was controversial. He was controversial. And so Luke, he denotes this account of Jesus. And I'm going to pick up in verse 17. He writes this. Jesus came down with them, his 12 disciples, and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. So Jesus has his 12, his core group of disciples, but there was also a larger group of disciples who followed him and listened to his teaching. And then there was further a crowd of people who came to hear what he had to say, who maybe were in the area and believed that this man could heal him of their sickness. And so Jesus is confronted by this huge crowd of people. And this is where Jesus goes into the Beatitudes, if you are familiar with those. Blessed are you who are poor, blessed are you who are hungry. And after he goes into the Beatitudes, he teaches this. And we're in Luke chapter 6, verse 27. He says, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from the one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you. And from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them." Jesus gives us these instructions to love our enemies. Now, this phrase, love our enemies, it kind of acts as the heading of this passage. Everything that he says beyond that shows us how we love our enemies. Now, the word enemy here, that is a thing to unpack in and of itself. So before we talk about our enemies, I first want to talk about just loving people in general. And I'm not necessarily talking about romantic love, but just loving the people in your life, your family members, your friends, your coworkers, your significant other. Can I say that loving people is not easy? It's not. Loving people is not easy. Anyone who has ever helped someone move knows that loving people is not easy. Last year, Scott and I moved into a new apartment, and we had a few friends who very graciously offered to help us. One of our friends became the person who carried all of our heavy boxes up the stairs. That was his designated job. And he carried all of our books, all of my books, let's be real, all of our furniture up these stairs. And after a couple of hours, we took a break, and he was sitting there, and he was kind of catching his breath. And I look at him, I'm like, "Hey, are you okay?" And he's like, "Yeah, so You failed to mention that your apartment was on the 3rd floor with no elevator. And I immediately just was like, oh, did I not mention that? I am so sorry. Did I fail to mention that you'd be carrying boxes up 2 flights of stairs for 3 hours? I am so sorry. Loving people is not easy. Loving people who love you back isn't easy. I got just a front row experience of this last week. I had the opportunity, my husband and I went and visited my brother and his family, and we got to spend the weekend with them. And they live in a different state, so we only see them about every 6 months. And they have 2 kids, my 4-year-old niece, my 2-year-old nephew. And this weekend, I got to watch my brother and my sister-in-law wake up their kids every morning, get them ready for the day, and get them fed. And then watch them put them to bed every single night. Now, for those of you who have ever babysat or nannied or who have young kids of your own, you know that this is not an easy task, right? It is not as simple as that. It is a task in and of itself. And I watched as when my beautiful niece would be grumpy or frustrated or irritated or just tired or maybe hungry, I don't know, and she would give her parents a hard time. I watched as my brother and sister-in-law responded to her with patience, with love, and with self-control. There was even a moment where my niece was upset about something, I don't remember what. My brother, 35-year-old grown man, kneeled down next to the kitchen table, looked her in her eyes, and apologized to his little 4-year-old girl. Loving people that you are biologically predisposed to love is not easy. It is not a simple thing. And Jesus, when he has a multitude, a massive crowd in front of him, he has the ear of hundreds of people, he takes the opportunity not to tell them how important it is to love their family members, which is true, but he takes this opportunity to tell them that they are to love their enemies. And he doesn't end here. He says this in verse 32. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners and get back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Jesus is standing before this crowd, and he says, oh, you love those who love you back? So what? Doesn't everyone? You do good to those who do good to you. So what? Doesn't everyone? You lend to those who you expect to receive it back in full. So what? Doesn't everyone? He's saying, no, if you're going to follow me, if you're going to be my disciple, your life is going to have to look a little bit different. Now, I'll be honest with you. When I've read this passage previously, I've thought that it doesn't really apply to me. And this is why. The word enemy is kind of a loaded word. Like, it's 2019. I don't believe that I have enemies, right? Like, I'm not living in a Marvel movie. I don't have an arch nemesis, like, sitting in the back plotting my demise, like, that I know of. There's, like, someone back there that's like, oh, Kelsey, you have no idea. Just you wait. Right? I don't have enemies. Yeah, I have people I don't get along with, people I don't prefer to spend my time with, but I don't necessarily believe that I have enemies. It's kind of a loaded word. But when Jesus uses the word enemy here, he means someone who is in opposition to you, someone who is opposed to you, someone who is different than you. He's saying your job is to love those who are different than you. To love those who don't think the way you think, believe the way you believe, or look the way you look. That is who we are supposed to love. It's interesting, there is a column in the New York Times called The Ethicist, and this philosopher, Kwame Anthony Appiah, he responds to readers' moral quandaries. So they can write him with their situation, and he will give what he believes is a moral or ethical response. In one of these columns, a woman was writing to him, and she was describing how she has this family member that isn't wise with her money. So she blows through a lot of her spending, has gotten herself into a significant amount of debt. And the reader, she was very responsible with her money. She has saved it up. She has a good chunk of savings. She has plans for that money. And this family member continues to approach her, asking her for loans. And so the reader is asking the ethicist, hey, what's my obligation here? Do I have to keep lending money to her when I know that she's not going to be able to pay it back? Do I have to keep lending money to her when I disagree with the way she uses it? And this is how he responds. He says this: you owe more to family members than you do to strangers, but you don't owe it to them to abandon all your hard-earned plans to pay for their mistakes. And we read that and think, well, yeah, that sounds like sound advice. It does. It sounds reasonable. It sounds wise, even moral. I don't have a problem with that answer. But the thing is, that's not how Jesus would respond. He's saying, no, not only are you obligated to lend and love the people who love you back, the people who are in your family, but you are obligated to do this even to strangers. You are obligated to love a stranger in the same manner that you would love a family member. That is your obligation here. And we hear that, and we see these instructions about loving our enemies, and it makes us uncomfortable. Right? It's kind of a hard pill to swallow. We kind of start squirming in our seats, like, please tell me that there is some way that we can get out of this. Right? But why is that? Why does this make us so uncomfortable? A woman named Karen Armstrong, she's a religious historian. She travels around the world and she speaks on a need for global compassion for one another. And she says this of her job. She says she's noticed this. Often people don't want to be compassionate. I sometimes see when I'm speaking to a congregation of religious people a sort of mutinous expression crossing their faces because people often want to be right instead. I think she's onto something. This is what I think. I think we have a difficulty swallowing this. We have a difficulty loving our enemies because we don't believe we should be required to love someone whom we deem unworthy of our love. We shouldn't have to love someone who we think does not deserve our love, who behaves in a way that we disagree with. We shouldn't have to love someone who stands in opposition to us. If you're driving through rush hour traffic on a Friday in downtown Spokane, this shows this to be true, right? You're driving in traffic and you're not happy about it. No one's happy about driving in traffic. I live 10 minutes from here, and if I leave at the wrong time, it will take me 25, right? Nobody enjoys driving in traffic, but we'll be civil, right? You'll be driving, you're like, okay, I'm going to follow the rules of the road. I'm not going to be happy about it, but I'm at least going to be civil, okay? But then the moment someone cuts you off, or someone merges in an intersection, or doesn't use their blinker, or does absolutely anything that you think is irresponsible on the road, you lose all civility, right? All of a sudden, you are a rage machine. You are saying words that you would never repeat in front of your family members. You're waving your hands in the air. You're laying on your horn, and you are more likely to then drive and behave in the same manner, right? Because that person, that car, does not deserve your civility anymore. They don't deserve your best self. They certainly deserve the worst. Right? We are willing to give our love, our kindness, our generosity, our time to people we think deserve it. But the second they do something that we disagree with, that we think deems them unworthy, we withhold. We pull back. We say, you know what? No, I'm done with you. You don't deserve my time. You don't deserve my energy, my resources, my money, my love. You don't deserve it. And Jesus disagrees. The writer Thomas Merton says this: our job is to love others without stopping to inquire whether or not they are worthy. That's what Jesus is saying here. Your job is to love others without stopping to inquire whether or not they are worthy. See, it is not your job to be judge and jury. It is not your job to determine whether or not that coworker or that family member or that stranger on the street is worthy of your love. That is not your burden to bear. Now we hear this and we think, okay, all right. I will love my enemies, sure. But can't I love them from afar? Right? Like, can't I just say, you know what? I appreciate you. I value you. I respect your opinion, right? But I'm not going to confront you. I'm not going to be in relationship with you. I can love you from a distance, right? That's what we hope for. But Jesus is saying no. See, I think something that we often get confused on today is we believe that love and tolerance are the same thing. Jesus is saying, no, that's not how this works. You don't just get to be tolerant of the people who stand in opposition to you. You don't just get to be okay with them, respect them, honor them from afar. No, loving someone requires proximity. When he tells us to do good, it is difficult to do good to someone that you're not near. When he tells you to lend your tunic to someone who has stolen your cloak, it requires you to extend your hand. To someone who strikes you, you're required to turn the other cheek, and it's hard to do that when you're not standing in front of them. To love someone requires you to move closer. When I was studying for this message, an often over-quoted phrase came to my mind, and it's this: the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. And I thought of that and I was like, I can't use that. It's too cheesy. Like, I can't say that. Then I started researching it and I was like, who even said this? Like, did this first come about on like a flowery Instagram post and it's just made it into our culture? Like, who first said this phrase? And I discovered that this was said by a man named Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor. He was put in a concentration camp with his family when he was a young boy. He watched both of his parents and his younger sister die. And he didn't see freedom until he was 17 years old and the camp was liberated by Allied troops. And after that, he became a writer and a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. And what he's saying is that you cannot appropriately love someone. You can't truly love someone and be indifferent to their pain, to their situation, and to themselves as a whole. He's saying true love requires action. It requires action. It is not a passive thing. It is active. It is face to face. So we hear this and we think, okay, that's great, right? It's beautiful. Jesus asks us to love our enemies. But haven't we already established earlier that loving people is exhausting? Right? Like, we've already established that it is difficult to love our own family members. Sometimes it is difficult on a bad day to love our own spouses. Like, it is already hard to love the people who love us back, let alone love our enemies. Does Jesus really believe that we are capable of this? Because it feels like an impossible task. This passage reminds me of a story about my grandpa. When my dad was little, he would take his two sons. They would load up their car and take them to church every single morning. And often my grandfather would kind of go around to various houses and pick up other people who needed a ride to church. And there was this one family that my grandfather met through my grandmother, who did a Bible study in the city that they lived in. This family was from a completely different background than my grandparents, had different views, were just completely opposed other than my grandfather. And he would go over to their house every Sunday morning and he would pick up their two little boys and take them to Sunday school. Now, sometimes, because their parents were alcoholics, he would pull up to the house and the parents would still be passed out from the night before. He would walk into a living room that was littered with just liquor bottles all over, and he would go get the boys, get them dressed, get them something to eat, and take them to Sunday school. And then to McDonald's, because my grandfather loved French fries. And he did this every single week. And right, we've already established that getting two young children ready in the morning is a task in and of itself. He already had to do this with my dad and my uncle, and he chose to do this for these two young boys as well. And we hear stories and we think, oh, that's beautiful. But we like to call people like my grandfather saints. We say, oh, he was an incredible man. What an incredible man of God. What an incredible woman of God. These people are fantastic. We hear stories about people who give up their shoes for those who are homeless, for dropping hundreds of dollars on groceries for a family in need. And we say, that is incredible, but that is not me. Right? We call them saints and we put them on a level higher than we are, thinking that it is something that we cannot possibly attain. Right? We think we cannot possibly live that way. Thank God there are people in this world who do, but I cannot possibly live in that manner. But if you were to say that to my grandfather, he would shake his head, smile, just kind of wave off what you're saying. And he would always point up. See, my grandfather understood something that I think it's hard for us to learn. And I think it's encapsulated really well in 1 John 4:9. We love because he first loved us. My grandfather understood that he could not love this family well because of his own ability, because of his own capacity to love, because he was an incredible person. No, he could love this family well because Christ loved him well. See, Christ was a very controversial person. They sought him dead, and they succeeded. Eventually, he was arrested, he was put through a sham of a trial, and he was hung on a cross. And while he was hanging there, he had a group of his enemies calling for his crucifixion, shouting names at him. And while he was standing there looking down into the face of his enemies, he said this, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." See, Jesus loved his enemies well. He loved them so well, in fact, that he died so that they might have life. Even looking in his enemies' eyes, he committed the greatest act of love in human history. And when he died on that cross, he made us worthy of his love, and he made our enemies worthy of his love as well. Our enemies are worthy of our love because Jesus declared them worthy of his. That's it. We don't have to bear the burden of trying to decide whether or not this person deserves or is worthy of our love and time and energy, because Jesus has already made that decision for us. He has declared from the cross that each and every person that we interact with is worthy of our love because they are worthy of his love. And we have the capacity and ability to love them, not because we are great or fantastic or able, but because Jesus made it possible on the cross. And we hear this and we're like, okay, so how does this resolve our issue? Right? The divisions that we feel, not just on a global scale, but in our own relationships with one another. How on earth does this possibly resolve the tension? And here's the thing. If we love our enemies well, if we say, you know what, I'm going to love you, you who stand in opposition to me, who are different than me, somebody who I have absolutely nothing in common with. If I'm going to extend my hand, if I'm going to love you well, that means I'm saying that the differences between you and me cannot divide us, that the power, the love of Jesus Christ is stronger than what divides us. And then we will form a community of people who do not think all of the same, who are not raised the same, who do not live in the same manner, who do not look the same, but we live in a community of people so vastly different that the only way we could ever be united is through the powerful, self-sacrificing, abiding love of Jesus Christ. And when people come knocking and they look at us and they see how different we all are, but how well we love one another, and they say, "How do you do it?" We won't say, "Well, you know, have you ever heard of Mother Teresa?" We'll just shake our heads, smile, and point up. Will you stand with me? May you be men and women who love everyone. Your family, those who love you back, and your enemies. Not because you believe that they deserve it, because Jesus has declared them worthy. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you need prayer, there are going to be people here at the front to pray for you, and we'll see you guys next week.